So welcome to the Friar of St. Michael the Archangel, Blackfriars, Cambridge, for our annual Aquinas Lecture. And this year's lecture will be given by Father Philip-Neri Reese. Father Philip-Neri Reese is a Dominican friar, a Catholic priest, and a professor of philosophy at the Pontifical University of St.Thomas, that is the Angelicum in Rome, where he also serves as the principal investigator for the Angelicum Thomistic Institute's project on philosophy and the Thomistic Tradition. He received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame in 2022. His main area of research is metaphysics and its methodology, with a specialist emphasis on the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas and its subsequent reception and interpretation. His publications, however, range widely, including articles on philosophical anthropology, ethics, and economics. He is also an enthusiast of classical Indian philosophy. And tonight, Father Philip-Neri will be speaking on Thomas Aquinas and the many goodnesses of creatures. So, thank you.
Let me begin this lecture with just a word of thanks. So thank you to Father Robert, thank you to the Dominican community here at Blackfriars, Cambridge, and thank you to all of you coming out. It is a true honor and privilege for me to be able to give the Aquinas Lecture here at Blackfriars in Cambridge. A few words about the lecture. So first, there is a handout. So I don't know if we've run out or not, but if we've run out, please share. This is unapologetically a talk in the history of philosophy and an exercise in Thomism, just because I have no other way to try to honor St. Thomas than the way that I know. So for those of you who are familiar with Aquinas' thought, there will be some aspects of this talk that are exploratory, let me say. But I am willing to die on the hill that none of this transgresses Aquinas' thought. For those of you who are less familiar with St. Thomas, my hope is that I will be able to take some of the more abstract metaphysical points and connect them in ways that that hopefully will make them relevant, or if not relevant, at least that you will see the import. You can tell me during the Q&A how drastically I have failed. So let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father in heaven, we ask that you would pour down upon us the grace and the gift of your Holy Spirit, to kindle in our hearts the fire of your love, and illuminate our minds with the light of your truth, so that in all things we may come to know you truly, love you deeply, and praise you worthily, through Christ our Lord. Amen. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thomas Aquinas and the many goodnesses of creatures. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, tame animals, crawling things, and every kind of wild animal." And so it happened. God made every kind of wild animal, every kind of tame animal, and every kind of thing that crawls on the ground. God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the tame animals, all the wild animals, and all the creatures that crawl on the earth." God created mankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. "Be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all the living things that crawl on the earth." God also said, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant on all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit on it, to be your food. And all the wild beasts, all the birds of the air, all the living creatures that crawl on the earth, I give all the green plants for food." And so it happened. Then God looked at everything he had made, and he found it very good. Evening came, and morning followed, the sixth day. Gnosticism has always been an enemy of Christianity. From the earliest days of the church, even to the present, there is a perennial temptation to cut the world in twain, to divide the world into the good and the bad, into the spiritual and the physical, into the extraordinary and the mundane. And along with that temptation to cut, there also comes a temptation to tie the spiritual to the good, to tie the physical to the bad, to tie the extraordinary to the first and the mundane to the second. But this is a temptation that every Christian must reject. As our opening passage from the book of Genesis clearly shows, divine revelation teaches us that God found everything he had made to be good, not just the extraordinary and the spiritual. Moreover, as Christians, we believe not only that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, but also that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and that in that same flesh he ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father, whence he shall come to judge the living and the dead. As such, we Christians believe that flesh, the body, is something that can be, has been, and is now sanctified, elevated, and divinized. Thus, we believe that the mundane and the physical is, at root, good. Given that the goodness of creatures is a basic tenet of Christian belief, we should not be surprised to find that it is also a common theme in the writing of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was, after all, a saint in the Christian church. Likewise, given that the goodness of creatures is a common theme in St. Thomas's writings, we should not be surprised to find that it is also a common theme among his subsequent followers and interpreters. What we should be surprised to find, however, is the way that this theme has often been presented by contemporary Thomists. For 20th century expositors of Aquinas tend to present his thought on the goodness of creatures as if it were the same thing as his doctrine of what is called transcendental goodness. To be very brief, Aquinas' doctrine of transcendental goodness claims that the terms good and being are coextensive, or to use his language, convertible. In other words, everything that's good is a being, and every being is something good. And the reason for this convertibility is that every being can be an object of desire, and that, being an object of desire, is the very notion of the good, transcendentally. It's the ratio bonitatis. To be sure, this is an important and substantive claim. For if it is true, it really does mean that any form of Gnosticism that seeks to deny the goodness of the physical, material world must be false. But is that all that can be said about the goodness of creatures in Aquinas' thought? Not by a long shot. And yet, it's this doctrine of transcendental goodness that receives the lion's share of scholarly attention. As such, I'd like to take this opportunity tonight to leave that standard presentation of Aquinas behind and focus our attention instead on the many ways that St. Thomas thinks creatures can be and are good that are not goodnesses of the transcendental sort. Moreover, I'd like to suggest, and perhaps provocatively, that these many non-transcendental goodnesses are both far more interesting for us to think about and far more important for understanding how Aquinas thought about the goodness of the created world. The structure of the talk is simple. First, I'm going to explain what Aquinas thinks the fundamental difference is between the goodness of God and the goodness of creatures. Then, I'm going to give a brief overview of the three modes or ways in which he thinks one thing can participate in another. The reason that will be important is that Aquinas thinks that all created goodness is participated goodness. With those three modes of participation in hand, I'd then like to look at the many goodnesses of creatures that correspond, or don't, to those modes of participation. Finally, we'll look at the ground we've covered, and I'll offer a few very brief closing reflections on why I think it's important that we have trod this path together. So, section 1, the goodness of God and the goodness of creatures. Aquinas' favorite way to distinguish between the goodness of God and the goodness of creatures is to say that God is good by essence, per essentia, whereas creatures are good by participation, per participazione. But what does that actually mean? To answer that question, to really wrap our minds around what Aquinas is getting at with this distinction between essence and participation, we need to look more closely at what he actually says. One of the earliest places where Aquinas distinguishes between God's essential goodness and the creature's participated goodness is in his disputed questions on truth. In question 21, article 5, he wonders whether some created good might be good by essence, per essentia. The problem behind the question is at least partly generated by the doctrine of transcendental goodness. On the one hand, if being and goodness are coextensive, then it should seem like goodness will be essential to being, and so creatures must be good by essence. On the other hand, it's hard to see how anything could be bad if everything is essentially good. Moreover, Christian theologians have frequently referred to God as goodness itself, the substantial good, the one true good, and the unparticipated good. But it's unclear what any of that could possibly mean if it's of the essence of everything to be good, rather than being unique to God alone. Much later in his career, in the prima pars of the Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas tackles the very same question, and in largely the same way. In both the early De Veritate text and the late Summa Theologiae, Aquinas answers the question by distinguishing between three things on account of which something might be called good, namely, the thing's substantial being, or esse substantiale, its accidental being, or esse accidentale, and its fulfilling of or attaining to its end, or its final cause, its purpose. And you can see those 3 points in text 1 on the handout. Now, I recently spent a few days with some of my Dominican brothers in the Umbrian countryside in Italy, and the trip was able to furnish me with a few examples. One from the realm of the artificial, the other from the realm of the natural. So first, let's consider a space heater. The Umbrian countryside is extremely cold. There's one sense in which we can call a space heater good just insofar as it exists. No matter how much better designed the space heater that the mechanical engineer friar comes up with in his head may be, as long as it remains stuck in his head, it doesn't exist, and it's not a good space heater. The good space heater is the one that's actually there. But the sense in which the space heater is good, that sense in which it's good, pales in comparison to the second sense, namely the sense that corresponds to accidental being rather than substantial being. To see why, just suppose that we were to find 2 existing space heaters in the house, only one of which actually works. Being functional is, in Aquinas' ontology, an accident of one of the space heaters, while being non-functional is an accident of the other. There is a very real sense in which the functional space heater is the good space heater, while the non-functional space heater is not, despite the fact that both equally exist. Now let's focus on the functional space heater. If, hypothetically of course, your bedroom only had 2 power outlets, one of which was on the opposite side of the room from your bed, the other of which was much closer, it would clearly be better to have the space heater plugged in to the nearer outlet rather than the farther one. And that wouldn't just be better for you. That would be better for the space heater. And the reason is because that's what the space heater is for. A space heater that only heats the half of the room that you are not in isn't fulfilling its function or attaining its end, even if it is, in some sense, functional. These three senses of good apply just as well to the realm of the organic and the natural as they do to the realm of the inorganic and the artificial. So, consider, also from my Umbrian trip, a possibly but not definitely domesticated cat that lurks right outside the door of your Umbrian house whenever you sit down to eat dinner. It's obviously better for the cat to be alive than to be dead. That sense of goodness for the cat corresponds to the substantial sense of goodness. But it's also obviously better for the cat to be well fed than to be starving, and that was the sense of goodness that's operating when it's pawing at the door. Finally, it's better for the well-fed cat to be living with other cats, such that it has the possibility of forming a family and giving birth to baby cats that will ensure the continuation of the species, than for that cat to be well-fed, but to be completely isolated and alone, devoid of the possibility of reproduction. Because that right there is the final causal sense of goodness. So it's not the substantial sense, it's not the accidental sense, it's how it's ordered towards its final cause. So, there are three things on account of which we call something good: substantial being, accidental being, and final causal being, or a final causal ordering. But St. Thomas insists that this distinction only holds at the level of creatures, and it collapses entirely when we turn our attention to the divine goodness. The reason has to do with divine simplicity. To put it simply, divine simplicity is the doctrine that says, here's a pithy little quote, anything in God is God. In broad strokes, that's divine simplicity. Anything in God is God. So, is there mercy in God? Yes. And that mercy is God. Is there justice in God? Yes. And that justice is God. Is there knowledge in God? Yes. And that knowledge is God. Mercy, justice, and knowledge, then, are one in God, for there is only one God. One of the downstream consequences of this notion of divine simplicity is that it leaves no room for a real distinction in God between substance and accidents. In the created order, it's one thing for Socrates to be human and a very different thing for Socrates to be wise. Human is what Socrates is. Wise is just what Socrates is like. The one expresses his substance, the other his accident. But divine simplicity requires that there be no such distinction in God. What God is and what God is like are one and the same. Socrates can cease to be wise without ceasing to be human, but God could never cease to be merciful or just or knowing without ceasing to be God. As such, it is impossible to distinguish one sense of divine goodness that corresponds to God's substantial being from another sense of divine goodness that corresponds to God's accidental being. For God has no substantial being distinct from his accidental being, or accidental being distinct from substantial being. The same can be said for the sense of goodness that's based on final causal ordering. In the created realm, there is often a real distinction between what something is and what something is for. Knives are for cutting, but knives aren't the same thing as cutting. Space heaters are for space heating, but space heaters aren't the same thing as space heating. Preachers are for preaching, but preachers aren't the same thing as preaching. Not so in God's case. For there is no distinction between what God is and what God is for. God and God's final cause are one and the same. The great I am is that for the sake of which he is. As such, it is impossible to distinguish between the substantial/accidental being of God and his fulfillment of or attainment to his final cause. They are simply one and the same. In creatures, then, there are three different senses of goodness, corresponding to three different bases or grounds for calling something good: substantial, accidental, and being well ordered to a final cause. In God, there is just one goodness, for the distinction between those three grounds collapses under the weight of divine simplicity. But what does any of this have to do with the distinction per essentiam per participatione? It's one thing to distinguish between divine goodness and creaturely goodness in the way that I just described. It's another thing entirely to connect that distinction to the notion of participation. And yet that's precisely what Aquinas does over and over and over again throughout his writings. So here's our question. Why? Why does Aquinas connect the distinction between divine goodness and created goodness with this distinction between being good by essence and being good by participation? To answer that question, I want to turn to the most important text in all of Aquinas' writings on participation. So section 2, modes of participation. In a famous passage from his commentary on the second chapter of Boethius's De Hebdomadibus, St. Thomas offers an almost etymological account of participation as one thing's partaking of or taking part of another. But as soon as he's given that general account of the notion of participation, he goes on to distinguish between three different ways or modes in which one thing can participate, partake of, or take a part of another. So I'd like to take a moment to think about each of these ways. With respect to the first way, he says, and this is text 2 on your handout, to participate is, as it were, to take a part. One thing is said to participate another, then, when it receives in a particular way what pertains in a universal way to the other. Just as man is said to participate in animal because it does not possess the full notion or ratio of animal according to its full commonality. And for that same reason, Socrates participates in man. This mode of participation is usually referred to by scholars as logical participation, and it's not hard to see why. Animal stands to man as a genus stands to a species, and man stands to Socrates as a species stands to an individual. As such, Socrates' participation in the notion of man is the participation of a particular, a singular, in a species, while man's participation in the notion of animal is the participation of a species in a genus. In both cases, what is being participated in is something that properly belongs to the domain of logic, according to St. Thomas, which is why it gets called logical participation. Though understandable, I'm not convinced that thinking about this first mode of participation in logical terms is the most helpful. First, because Aquinas himself never mentions logic in connection with this mode of participation. Second, because the feature that Aquinas seems to be focused on isn't exclusively logical. For the thing that really seems to be doing the work of picking out or distinguishing this sense of participation is the dichotomy between particularity and universality. And that dichotomy pertains just as much to metaphysics as it does to logic. So I'd like to propose a different way of thinking about or categorizing this first way of participation. It's participation as particularization. Or, if you're more at home in contemporary philosophical parlance, it's participation as instantiation. What we have in both of Aquinas' examples are cases of something more common or general or universal being contracted or determined or narrowed down to something less common, general, and universal. So the participant is an instance of the thing it participates in. This participation as particularization relation, however, is not what we find when we turn to Aquinas' second mode of participation. His characterization of this mode is briefer than the first, but still includes two examples. He says, this is text 3 on your handout, in a similar way, a subject also participates in an accident, and matter participates in a form, because a substantial or accidental form, the notion or ratio or character of which is common, is determined to this or that subject. At first glance, it might not be easy to see how this mode differs from the first. After all, in both cases we have a ratio or a notion or a kind of intelligible character that's common. And in both cases, we also have a determination relation. But the way in which the common notion is rendered determinate is not the same in both cases. For it's one thing to say that X is an instance of Y. It's a very different thing to say that X is a subject of Y. Prime matter in Aquinas' metaphysics and natural philosophy is certainly the subject of substantial form. But prime matter is not an instance of substantial form. The only instance of substantial form is the very substantial form itself that is received into prime matter. Likewise, a hylomorphic composite of prime matter and substantial form may well be the subject of some further accident, right? So Socrates can be the subject of his feature or characteristic wisdom, but it will never be an instance of that accidental form. Socrates is not an instance of wisdom. The only instance of the accidental form is the very accidental form itself that is received into the composite substance. So Socrates' wisdom is an instance of wisdom. Socrates is not an instance of wisdom. Socrates is the subject of Socrates' wisdom. This second mode of participation has sometimes been referred to as act potency participation, and it's not hard to see why. After all, prime matter stands to substantial form as potency stands to act, and a subject, a substance, stands to accidental form as potency stands to act. In both cases, then, we have an act-potency relation. Though understandable, I'm not convinced that this way of thinking about the second mode of participation in terms of actuality and potentiality is the most helpful. First, because Aquinas himself never mentions actuality and potentiality in this context. Second, because act-potency relations have a much wider scope in Aquinas' mind than this second mode of participation allows. To see why, all we need to do is consider the fact that one of the examples that Aquinas gave of the first mode of participation can also be analyzed in terms of act and potency for St. Thomas. For Aquinas thinks that a species, like man, is constituted by a proximate genus and a specific difference, rational animal. And that the relationship between a genus, animal, and a specific difference, rational, is like the relationship between potency and act. So, I'd like to propose a different way of thinking about or categorizing this second way of participation. It's participation as real composition. What we have in both cases, both the case of prime matter receiving or determining substantial form, and in the case of substance receiving or determining accidental form, is a case of what St. Thomas calls real composition. Prime matter is really, that is, mind independently composed with substantial form. They make a kind of whole. Just as a substance is really, that is, mind independently composed with an accidental form. They make a kind of whole. So we can talk about wise Socrates as a kind of whole, just as we can talk about Socrates as a kind of whole. But that's not true in the case of genus and difference. A species is not really composed of genus and difference for the simple reason that a species, like a genus and a difference, only exists in the mind. As such, their composition is thoroughgoingly mind-dependent. It's not real. Likewise, there's no real composition involved in Socrates' participation in the species man, for the equally simple reason that the species man, unlike the man Socrates, only exists in the mind. So if there are any Platonists here in the room, sorry. Standing on opposite sides of the chasm between real being and being of reason, Socrates and his species cannot enter into any composition at all. Real composition, then, is the joint carving feature that distinguishes this second mode or way of participation from the first. What about the third mode? Despite the fact that this mode of participation has received the most attention in the 20th and 21st centuries, it remains in many ways the most obscure. St. Thomas describes it as follows. This is text 4. In a similar way, an effect also participates in its cause, and especially when it doesn't measure up to the power of its cause. For example, if we should say that air participates in the light of the sun because it does not receive the sun's light with the radiance that is present in the sun. This mode of participation is usually referred to as efficient causal participation, and it's not hard to see why. The sun's light is the efficient cause of the illumination of the air, and that illumination is an effect that falls short of the full causal power of the light of the sun. The sun's light can do a whole lot of other things besides light up the air. It can heat the earth. Though understandable, I worry that this way of describing the third mode of participation might be misleading. The reason is because talking about it as efficient causal participation might lead people to think that it pertains to the order of efficient causality to the exclusion of the other causal orders. But as soon as the other causal orders are banished from the third mode of participation, two serious problems arise. First, it becomes unclear why a relation to an efficient cause ought to be called participation at all. Second, we blind ourselves to the mechanisms of how this mode of participation is supposed to work, according to St. Thomas. To see why, we just need to consider what he says in the response to the fourth objection of De Veritate 21:1. There, while distinguishing the influence of the final cause from the influence of the efficient cause, he says, this is text 5, good expresses the diffusion of a final cause, not of an agent or efficient cause. This is both because the efficient cause, as such, is not the measure and perfection of a thing, but rather is the thing's beginning, and because an effect participates in an efficient cause only according to an assimilation of its form, whereas a thing follows upon its final cause according to its whole being, and the ratio or notion of the good consists in that. Okay, there's a lot going on in that passage, but for our purposes right now, the most important part is Aquinas' clarification of how an effect participates in an efficient cause. He says that it does so only according to an assimilation of its form. How could efficient causal participation depend on something's form? Shouldn't that make it formal causal participation? Not necessarily. For there are two axioms that Aquinas frequently employs that can serve to connect the dots here between efficient causality and participation through formal assimilation. One, I'll do the Latin first, omne agens agit sibi simile, so every agent effects something like itself. And the other, that's far less frequently quoted, omne agens agit per suam forma, every agent effects something through its form. With those two principles in place, a clear line of thought emerges. If efficient causes only act through their forms, and effects are always in some way similar to their efficient causes as such, then there must be some similarity between the form of the effect and the form of the efficient cause. But why should this similarity count as participation? What does it have to do with the notion of partaking of or taking a part of something? Here, I think, is where we should remember Aquinas' caveat when introducing the third mode of participation. He said, an effect participates in its cause, especially when it does not measure up to the full power of its cause. When the form of the effect fully measures up to the form of the efficient cause, we probably won't use the language of participation, since the effect doesn't really take a part of its cause. It's just a mirror image of the whole thing. But when the form of the effect doesn't fully measure up to the form of the efficient cause, when it doesn't fully capture or express the form through which it has been produced, then we are much more likely to use the language of participation. For the form of the effect only captures or expresses some part of the power of its cause. Let me give you some examples. When a brilliant musician composes a beautiful piece of music, that piece of music expresses the musical genius, the technical expertise, the artistic power of its composer. But no matter how beautiful, how moving, how brilliant that piece of music is, it doesn't express all of the composer's genius. It doesn't express all of the technical expertise of its creator. It doesn't express the full power of its producer's artistry. Insofar as the form of the composition gives voice to part of, but not all of, the form through which it was brought into the world, we can and do think of that piece of music as participating in the musician's artistic excellence. But when parents bring a child into the world, the situation is very different. No matter how much poetic license we allow ourselves, a child is importantly not like a song. For a piece of music can only express or reflect the tiniest sliver of its composer. It gives voice to his musical talent and nothing or very little more. It cannot express, for example, his talent at painting, his capacity to run, his ability to dream. It cannot do everything its composer can. But a child bears within itself all those possibilities. It possesses all of those powers. It contains all of those capacities. Everything the father might have been, the son could yet be. All that the mother failed to do, the daughter might yet fulfill. When parents bring a child into the world, the form of the effect is no less than the form of its cause. The child is as fully, as perfectly, and as equally human as its parents. As such, the sense in which sons and daughters participate in their fathers and mothers is far more restricted. For the only sense in which they fall short of or fail to measure up to the power of their parents is this: their parents could have or could have had other children. The limit case for this reflection is the generation of the Son by the Father within the life of the Blessed Trinity. For the Father could not have had another son than the Son. He could not have spoken another word than the word. He could not have sung another song than the song. For the Son falls short of the Father in absolutely nothing. The Word expresses everything the Father has to say, and once it has been spoken, the Father abides in silence. Everything the Father has, everything the Father is, the Son receives. He is the one true image of the Father, and he does not participate in the Father's life at all. He is that life. He does not participate in the Father's truth. He is the Father's truth. He does not participate in the Father's wisdom. He is the Father's wisdom. And here, within the Trinity, where participation fails, efficient causality fails too. For the Son is generated by the Father, not efficiently caused by him. He is, as we say in the Creed, begotten, not made. The third mode of participation, then, is efficient causal participation. For efficient causality always involves both a formal similarity between cause and effect and some sense of failure to measure up on the part of the effect vis-a-vis the cause. And so there will always be some way in which the effect takes part, but only part, in its efficient cause. Section 3, participated goodnesses. Okay, let's do a little bit of recap. In section 1, we saw that from the beginning to the end of his career, Aquinas repeatedly defends the claim that creatures are only good by participation by appealing to three different grounds or bases upon which creatures can be good: their substantial being, their accidental being, and their fulfilling of or attaining to their ends. Since it wasn't clear what these three things have to do with participation, we turned our attention in section 2 to Aquinas' most famous and systematic account of participation. And there we saw him claim that there are three ways or modes in which one thing can participate or take part in something else: by instantiating it or particularizing it, by entering into real composition with it, and by bearing an inadequate formal similarity to it, provided that the it is its efficient cause. Now, if you're anything like me, you will find it extremely tempting to line up these two threefold divisions. It would be so elegant, so beautiful, so compellingly simple if each of the three kinds of created goodness lined up exactly with one and only one of the three modes of participation. Unfortunately, things are not quite that simple. Or maybe I should say, fortunately, things are not quite that simple. For I think that the complex overlap of our three divisions actually gives us a far more interesting account of creaturely goodness than a one-to-one correspondence would. So here I'm just going to everything that I'm going to say next is contained in crystalline form in table 1 on your handout. There is sadly a little part of the top axis of table 1 was cut off, so each one of those should have the word goodness with it. So substantial goodness, accidental goodness, final causal goodness. All right, so let's see how they all overlap and how they relate. Let's start with the first mode of participation as particularization or instantiation. It seems to me that this mode of participation will apply to all three kinds of creaturely goodness. The cat that is good in the sense of being alive, i.e. being a cat, is an instance of the general kind of creaturely goodness that we have called substantial goodness. The cat that is good in the sense of being well-fed is an instance of the general kind of creaturely goodness that we have called accidental goodness. And the cat that is good in the sense of being a well-fed cat living in community with other cats such that it can achieve its biological end, i.e. reproduction, is an instance of the general kind of creaturely goodness that we have called final causal goodness. So in each case, you've got a general kind that could be instantiated in a whole lot more than any one particular instance. So each particular instance is, as it were, a part of the general kind. And so it's participation. The first mode, then, is pretty straightforward in how it applies to creatures. The problem is that when Aquinas distinguishes God's goodness as per essentia from created goodness as per participationem, this mode of participation doesn't seem to be what he has in mind. It's true that God is not an instance or particularization of a more general type like divine goodness, the way that creatures are instances or particularizations of more general types of created goodness. That's true. But that isn't the reason that Aquinas gives for distinguishing divine goodness from created goodness. Just return again to text 1. You'll see that's not what he's talking about. The application of the first mode of participation to the participated goodnesses of creatures, then, is straightforward, but not especially relevant. Far more relevant to the distinction between God's goodness and created goodness, though slightly less straightforward, is the second mode of participation, participation as real composition. In fact, the first two kinds of creaturely goodness, a creature's having substantial being and its having accidental being, seem to correspond directly to the two examples that Aquinas gives of the second mode of participation in text 3. When prime matter participates in, i.e. is really composed with, a substantial form, the immediate consequence of that real composition is the communication of substantial being through the form to the matter. And so substantial being is had by the composite in and through the real composition of form and matter. Likewise, when a subject participates in, i.e. is really composed with, an accidental form, the immediate consequence of that real composition is the communication of accidental being through the form to the substance. In both cases, then, it's the form's communication of and composition with esse, being, that renders the creature good. Nevertheless, Aquinas also insists that these two instances of compositionally participated goodness are not equally good. For he insists that what is good for a creature simply is its accidental goodness. For its substantial goodness is only good for it in a certain respect. We can put the point like this. It's good for a man to be a man. But simply being a man doesn't make him a good man. A good man without qualification, simpliciter, is, ironically, a man with qualifications. The man who is temperate and courageous, just and prudent, compassionate and dependable. And those are accidental features. In this respect, goodness, St. Thomas says, is actually the inverse of being. For substantial being is what counts as being simply, full stop, without qualification, while accidental being is only being in a certain respect. Now, given the emphasis that most Thomists in recent years have placed on the transcendental notions of goodness and being, it's probably worth my taking a moment at this point to note that neither being without qualification nor being in a certain respect is the transcendental notion of being. Just as neither good without qualification nor good in a certain respect is the transcendental notion of goodness. The reason is simple. The transcendental notions of being and goodness need to characterize all beings and all good things, whether substantial or accidental. But substantial being and goodness, i.e. being simply and good in a certain respect, only characterize substances. Whereas accidental being and goodness, so being in a certain respect, and goodness simpliciter, only characterize accidents. The transcendental notions, then, are either disjunctions of these ordered pairs, and there was a Dominican named Heraeus Natalis who held that position, or they're notions that are so analogically thin that they can apply across the disjunction between being good simply and being good in a certain respect, being a being simply and being a being in a certain respect. And there were other Renaissance Thomists who held that position. But I will not bore you with their names. So, both the substantial goodness of creatures and the accidental goodness of creatures are participated goodnesses in this second mode of participation, but not equally. The accidental goodnesses of creatures is a gooder goodness, as it were, than the substantial goodness of creatures. For it is a deeper participation in the very character of goodness itself. But what about the third type of creaturely goodness, final causal goodness? Is there any sense in which creatures are good in this way, by participation, in the sense of participation that corresponds to this second mode? Here, I think the answer is no. When I move the space heater's position within my room, such that it can now cast heat on me, rather than merely casting heat, that space heater enters into a new set of real relations, but it does not enter into a new set of real compositions. It is really related to the things that it heats. It is not really composed with the things that it heats. So in contemporary philosophical parlance, Aquinas is not a mereological universalist. In the De Veritate, he's actually not subtle about this point at all. Wise philosophers and theologians, he tells us, with Boethius first among them, all admit that creatures are only finally causally good insofar as they are well ordered to God. But only the foolish would think that God enters into some kind of real composition with creatures. For the only way for that to happen, the only way for God to enter into real composition with creatures would be, A, for him to be their matter. And this is the view of a guy named David of Dinant, who Aquinas almost meanly calls stultissimus, the most stupid man. So you could think that the only way to think that God really enters into composition with creatures is as their matter, which is the most stupid thing you could think. Or he would enter into real composition with creatures as their form, which, aside from the problem of just being pantheism, is incompatible with the Christian doctrine of creation, since no form efficiently causes itself. So if God was the form of all creation, then God couldn't be the efficient cause of all creation, which means no creation. Okay, this does not mean, however, that the final causal goodness and the second mode of participation are totally unrelated. For a creature's ability to attain its final cause presupposes both its substantial existence and its accidental perfections. The starving cat is not well suited for reproduction, nor can the space heater in my engineer Dominican brother's mind be well positioned in my room. There is then a progressive character across the three kinds of creaturely goodness. Just as the creature must be substantially good in order for it to be accidentally good, so too it must be both substantially and accidentally good in order for it to be final causally good, in order for it to be in right relation with things so as to be able to attain its end. Likewise, just as the accidental goodness of the creature is a gooder goodness than its substantial goodness, so too its final causal goodness is a gooder goodness than its substantial and accidental goodness. For it is only with this third kind of creaturely goodness that the creature actually attains to its end, which is the fullest and richest sense in which creatures can be called good. Despite this progressive dependence, however, it's important to recognize that the third and highest kind of creaturely goodness cannot be a participated goodness in the second mode of participation, like substantial and accidental goodness are. Thus, if the first mode of participation applies to final causal goodness, but isn't what Aquinas has in mind when he distinguishes between God's goodness and creaturely goodness, and the second mode of participation does not apply at all to final causal goodness, then it seems like we still haven't figured out why that kind of goodness, the most important kind of creaturely goodness, should count as goodness by participation. Do we find an answer when we turn to the third mode of participation, participation as efficient likeness? Like the first mode of participation, and unlike the second, it certainly does seem like this mode of participation can be found in all three types of creaturely goodness. For every composite of form and matter must have an efficient cause of its substantial being, and every composite of substance and accident must have an efficient cause of its accidental being. And everything that is well ordered so as to be able to attain its end must have an efficient cause of its being thusly well ordered. In each of these cases, then, there will be a form, be it substantial or accidental or relational, that is similar to the form of the efficient cause that brought it about. And so there will be participation in the third mode. But will that be participated goodness? Not if we take text 5 seriously. A creature is not made good simply in virtue of its being formally similar to an efficient cause. It's made good in virtue of the degree to which it attains its end. The first and most proximate end of a creature is its substantial act of being. Its more remote ends are the accidents and the operations that are proper to it, according to its nature. And the most remote end, its ultimate end, is the common good of the entire universe, which is intrinsically the good order of the cosmos and extrinsically God. So yes, there will be an efficient cause corresponding to each of these three ends, substantial being, accidental being, and being well ordered. But the creature is not made good by its likeness to those efficient causes. It's made good by its achieving those distinct ends. So where does that leave us? Well, we know that for Aquinas, all created goodness is participated goodness. That's what makes it different than divine goodness. We also know that for Aquinas, there are three kinds of created goodness: substantial goodness, accidental goodness, and final causal goodness, or the goodness of being well ordered. It follows then that for Aquinas, substantial, accidental, and final causal goodness are all participated goodnesses. So to make sense of that, we turn to the most important passage on participation in Aquinas' corpus, where he identifies three modes of participation. The first mode applies to all three created goodnesses, but isn't what St. Thomas has in mind when he distinguishes participated creaturely goodness from divine essential goodness. The second mode of participation applies to substantial goodness and accidental goodness, but not to the goodness of being well ordered towards its end. And the third mode of participation applies to none of them at all, at least as goodness. This means that the participated character of St. Thomas's third kind of created goodness, the one that he identifies as the most important and the richest of all, the goodest of the good, cannot be accounted for by his most famous discussion of participation. We must, in other words, posit a fourth mode of participation, the teleological participation of a thing in its end, in order to account for this final causal goodness. While certainly an expansion on what St. Thomas says in his commentary on Boethius' De Heptamatibus, I don't think this constitutes a violent expansion. It's more like a natural outgrowth. For this teleological participation satisfies the core notion of participation that Aquinas appeals to, a partaking in or taking a part of something. When a space heater is correctly positioned within a room so as to warm precisely the things that it was made to warm, or when a well-fed cat lives in community with other cats so as to keep the species from extinction, it is contributing to something greater than itself. Like the different sections of an orchestra, or the divvying up of jobs within a Dominican community, each one has a part to play, though it only ever just plays a part. Nevertheless, by playing that part, it is elevated and incorporated into something that it could never do, something it could never be all on its own. Viewed in this light, teleological participation might well be participation par excellence, just as final causal goodness is created goodness par excellence. For teleological participation is able to assimilate and integrate all the other modes of participation. Section 4, an extremely brief concluding reflection. What does it mean to say that God looked at everything he had made and he found it very good? While it's not false to explain this fundamental truth of the Christian faith by appealing to transcendental goodness, the notion that everything is good just insofar as it is a being, because every being can be the object of desire, that's not remotely enough. At least, not if you're St. Thomas. For St. Thomas, the goodness of creatures is a pluriform goodness, a manifold goodness. And it must be pluriform. It must be manifold. For God alone is truly simple, and God alone is truly good. One of the many goodnesses of creatures is their substantial goodness. This is a participated goodness, both because the creature is made good by participating in or entering into real composition with its substantial act of being, and because it participates in or instantiates the common notion, the common idea of substantial goodness. This is also a participated goodness. Another of the many goodnesses of creatures is their accidental goodness. And this is also a participated goodness, both because the creature is made good by participating in or entering into real composition with its proper accidents and operations, like Socrates engaging in an act of wisdom, and because it participates in or instantiates the common notion, the idea of accidental goodness. It's also a greater goodness, a gooder goodness than substantial goodness. The final goodness of creatures is their final causal goodness. It too is a participated goodness, but not in virtue of any real composition. Rather, this is a teleological and relational participation, wherein the creature is caught up in a greater directionality, a wider movement, a more sweeping cooperation than any that it could have achieved on its own. The creature is like one part or one instrument in the orchestra of the cosmos. There is then a dynamic character to the goodness of creatures. There's a dynamic character to that which God called very good. This divine declaration need not, should not, and perhaps even must not be interpreted as a static statement of how things stood in the first moment of creation. It was also a radical revelation of what they could be, should be, and would be. Very good. In the created order, then, the goodness that really matters is not a given. It's something that has to be simultaneously received and achieved, which is to say, it is participated goodness. Or, to speak more precisely, many participated goodnesses, each of which reflects in its own way, and all of which reflect together, the unparticipated goodness that God alone has by essence. Thank you.
So we do have some time for some questions. So anybody
or withering critique. Yes, either one.
Sister Magdalena.
Thank you very much
Sure.
for the wonderful talk. I just have a question for that very last bit, though. Why we need the fourth one? Because the third participation, the causal participation, would seem to work to me because the substantial goodness, of course, of the creature, the goodness of being, the accidental goodness is that all, as Aquinas says, all the perfections pre-exist in God.
Yep.
And so we participate in those. And of course by grace as well as a supernatural participation. And then the final cause, we have those operative habits, right, that, for example, from the divine missions, the wisdom and charity.
Yep.
So it seems that would be enough to make us, because it's a likeness, precisely as what he says, right, the similarity of the creatures being made like God. It just seems like that would that would work, the third kind.
Yeah, good. So what do you make of text 5?
Text 5.
So the term good expresses the diffusion of a final cause, not of an agent or efficient cause. And this is both because the efficient cause as such is not the measure and perfection of the thing, right? So yes, the efficient cause pre-contains the thing, but the efficient cause as efficient cause is not the measure of the thing, but rather it's the thing's beginning, and because an effect participates in an efficient cause only according to an assimilation of the form, right? Whereas the character of the good is extending to the whole being. So I guess let me, I'll put my response this way, is I'm very open to a sort of more expansive notion of efficient causality that includes divine exemplarism, for example, right? And thinking about the preeminent containment of all the created forms in God as divine exemplars actually might make your case even stronger, right? Because we can't think of divine exemplars without thinking about God acting through creation for an end, right? Which ultimately is his own glory, right? But what I'm worried about is any kind of expansion of or inflation of the notion of efficient causality that would make what Aquinas says in text 5 false.
Mm-hmm. Could it be though, I'm sorry, this is,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe this only applies to God who is all the final cause himself,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the efficient cause and the exemplar. You know what I mean? It wouldn't apply to any created cause, but only to God. To be all three. I mean, I don't know if that works. But,
Let me think about it. Yeah. It's an interesting suggestion. Yeah. Thanks.
John.
I was rather puzzled. It seemed to me that if your account of Aquinas was right, there seems to be an equivocation on the word good. I'm thinking of the case of, for example, if you take a malarial mosquito, now that's good at causing malaria. But in what other sense is it good at all? And if it didn't do that, it couldn't exist as a mosquito. And it would also imply, presumably, that it would be not a good idea to try and exterminate malarial mosquitoes.
Yes. Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you. So I'm very wary about saying what I'm about to say because I know that I'm, the ghost of Geach is still here, and Geach has a very among Thomists, right, a very influential and very important interpretation of specifically the notion of good, right, and how good functions as a predicate that I studiously avoided in this whole talk. But I think if our notion of good is Geach's notion, then I think the criticism that you just raised is extremely powerful. Because if there is no such thing as a predicate that's just good, simpliciter, and there's only the predicate good for, right, which is a two-term predicate, then it becomes very hard to see how you could say something like, the extinction of mosquitoes would be good in any sense, right? Or in any sense that doesn't imply equivocation. My view of the notion of goodness and my read on Aquinas is that it is the notion of analogy is an extremely fraught question on which I have extremely opinionated views, but I'm not going to invoke them here. Let me just say this. I do think that the notion of, the analogical notion of goodness is robust enough that it's not going to be equivocal in cases like that, right? And so, with respect to mosquitoes, so it's surely the case that, being killed is not good with respect to substantial goodness for the mosquito, right? It might be good with respect to final causal goodness for just in general, full stop, right? And so, I mean, this is why Aquinas thinks in the prelapsarian context, it's only by divine miracle that lions don't eat lambs. And in the eschaton, it's only by miracle that creatures don't die. Which is to say that according to their natures, right, they would. So the death of something is going to be bad for it, but not bad full stop. At least not if the kind of bad you're talking about is what I'm calling final causal goodness.
Okay.
Can I ask, a lot of the human race has already decided an answer to this, and I'm convinced it's wrong. Christians would not give this answer. But parents who are good, normal people, also full of the virtues and so forth, have a child who is Down syndrome child. I'm partly influenced on this by the fact that the trousers I'm wearing at the moment, I bought at Marks and Spencer's from someone who had Down syndrome, who was absolutely brilliant. He saw exactly what I needed, he checked out my needed measurements and identified the trousers, which excuse me.
Excellent trousers.
Now, yes, I thought I was. But the sort of notion that a Down syndrome child can be aborted at any time as soon as it's known seems to me so wrong.
Yes.
How would Aquinas actually deal with that question, do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think, and actually one on which the ability to distinguish between many goodnesses is actually, I think, key for an authentically Thomistic response, right? Because I think what the Thomists, so let me paint you two extremes here that really exist. So extreme one are folks like the folks that you've described, who think that because of some lack of accidental goodness, therefore, they're, in a certain sense, what they do is they just ignore the genuine goodness of substantial goodness, right? They think that because this child lacks some accidental perfection, right, which really is a perfection, right? Therefore, the child it's not worth it for the child to exist, right? And so in a certain sense, the error that you're pointing to is the error of failing to recognize the goodness of substantial goodness. On the other hand, there are a number of people, and this has been a sort of interesting fad to watch in contemporary, historians of medieval philosophy. A lot of folks have been doing work on questions of disability, and particularly disability, theories of disability in the Middle Ages, and looking at disabilities in the eschaton. And so there are a number of contemporary scholars who have been trying to use certain scholastic theories of disability to say that in the resurrection, a Down syndrome person will still have Down syndrome, or a lame person will still be lame, a blind person will still be blind. In a certain sense, I think this is diametrically opposed the opposite error, right? So it's an error of thinking that the only relevant sense of goodness is substantial goodness, and it's a refusal to recognize that accidental perfections are genuinely good, right? And so people who have genuine disabilities, right, in the sense that of people who lack the proper accidents or operations that are proper to our human nature, right? They think those will not be restored, rejuvenated, and perfected in heaven. So I think that the authentically Thomistic view is the very safe middle ground, which is recognizing a plurality of goodnesses. So on the one hand, the fact that there is such a thing as substantial goodness guarantees that we don't commit atrocities like just aborting anyone that we think is insufficiently developed or lacks certain qualities. On the other hand, our recognition of the genuine and real character of accidental goodness allows us to give people the promise of hope that, in heaven you will be healed, right? It's not just that, like, in heaven you will no longer feel dissociated from your, wound or your disability. No, Jesus will really heal you, right? So if you have many goodnesses, you can speak to both errors.
Just himself.
Okay.
Just a remark on that. I think that possibly comes from when somewhere Thomas is saying that are people more intelligent than each other in heaven? He said, yeah, but it doesn't matter because the vision of God is so powerful and trivial. In that sense, otherwise you say that the smarter people know more of a God than the dumber people, and of course Thomas thinks it's the better people that know more of a God than the...
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, great. So thank you. I promise everyone here, these are not like plant questions, because actually that point lets me then speak to, in a kind of eschatological context, to the third kind of goodness, right? So the goodness of the final causal goodness or the well-ordered goodness, precisely because the good order of the saints in heaven actually requires inequality, right? So unless Jesus has some radical transformation of my spiritual life in store, right? I can be pretty certain that Saint Therese will love God more than me when we get to the end, right? Now, hopefully I'll be up there, right? And, I'll be somewhere many ranks down from her, and I can kind of look up and see Therese loving God with such incredible love, right? But the reality is the beauty and the goodness of God is manifested by harmonious inequality better than it would be manifested by universal homogeneity, right? And so in just the same way that a garden is more beautiful when it has flowers of different colors arranged in different ways than it is if it's just a garden that has homogeneously, or homogeneously the most beautiful of those flowers, right? And so that's the sense of final causal goodness, right? That we all, in a kind of unequal cooperation, can play a part in something that's actually magnitudes more good and beautiful than what even the highest of individual goodnesses could produce. Yes?
When you were talking about transcendental goodness in the beginning, good being coextensive.
Wait, you're here. You're not in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Hi. Okay, great. Yeah. Where am I right now? No.
That threw me off. Okay. Good and being coextensive. When you say transcendental, does that refer to substantial form? And if so, is there any connection to transcendental in the way that Kant uses it to try and prove God's existence as the creator of transcendental substantial form?
Yeah, good question. So the short answer is no to both.
Okay.
To the first, transcendental goodness or transcendental being, right, doesn't correspond to just substantial goodness or just substantial being because, so for Aquinas, when you say being, that's going to apply to all 10 Aristotelian categories. So substance and anything that falls in one of the 9 categories of accidents. So here's something that is a substance like a cat. Here's something that is, this is a proclivity of mine that I did not manifest during the talk, but here's something else that is, a quality that all cats have, being horrible and wicked, right? So cats exist, and cat's horrible wickedness exists, right? Also, like a cat's quantity of being too fat, right, exists, right? And a cat's, relation of being hated by me exists, right? And so we can go through all of the 10 categories, right? And everything in any of the 10 categories is a being. And so what transcendental means roughly for Aquinas is not limited to one of the categories. What transcendental means for Kant is very different. There are early modern scholastics who kind of bridge. They go some way in bridging the gap between the scholastic notion and the Kantian notion of transcendental. But roughly, what the Kantian notion of transcendental means is something that is presupposed by and so prior to any experience.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
So to return to the issue of substantial goodness and accidental goodness in the case of the mosquito and malaria.
Yeah.
So malaria, the mosquito's purpose in life is not to give us malaria. In fact, it's not the mosquito that gives us the malaria. The mosquito is feeding.
Right.
When it bites.
I mean, I'll take your word for it. Yeah.
So in a sense, the mosquito, by being good at feeding, fulfills its final causal goodness. By feeding, it can stay alive and actually produce more.
Or at least it's on its way.
Yes.
Right.
And it's actually a parasite in the mosquito that is so good at exploiting that to reproduce itself inside of us. And by reproducing, our immune system tries to kill it,
Right.
and therefore kills us. So one could say it's our immune system that is not being good. But again, it isn't true, because the immune system is there to make us survive, right? So it is fulfilling its final causal goodness.
Yeah, good. So I mean, I think one of the virtues of this pluriform account is that it empowers us to give pretty detailed axiological analyses of these situations, right? So you can say things like this. Feeding is good in the sense of an accidental goodness. Feeding on my flesh or my blood, right, is accidentally good for the mosquito. Being fed on by the mosquito is accidentally bad for me, right? If there are weird diseases going on in the mosquito, you can axiologically analyze the substantial, accidental, and final causal goodnesses for the disease, right? And so we can multiply the analyses, and I imagine that the more we do, the more accurate our account will be.
Yeah, but what I was getting to my point is that the way to cure us from not dying of malaria is not necessarily only to exterminate all mosquitoes, but is to find a way to prevent this transmission of the pathogen from the mosquito to us.
Yeah, no objection here.
Yeah, and that would be the greater good for both the mosquito and ourselves.
Yeah, it might be. I mean, I hate mosquitoes a lot, so I'm going to need further proof, but I'm open to being convinced. Yeah.
What I'm saying is that once one analyzes the thing, you can find a greater good without contradicting the substantial good of all things need, somehow.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. The only thing that I would add is just this. So with respect to the goodness of the final causal ordering, Aquinas does think, and this ends up being actually an important element in his ethics. And so it comes up in his kind of political ethics. It comes up in what you might call his biomedical ethics, right? That within the context of a pluriform whole, a part can and often should be sacrificed for the good of the whole, right? So a diseased limb can be and sometimes should be cut off for the sake, and so so the so to speak quasi-substantial being of your hand, right, can under certain circumstances be cut off for the sake of the good of the whole, right? An 18-year-old, healthy, man can be drafted for the sake of the good of the nation, right? And can be called upon to lay down his life, right? So yes, so but I think in the vast majority of the cases, I'm with you. When it's possible to preserve the substantial good of something, we should preserve it. Yeah.
Can I just come back on the
Yeah, sure.
relation point, but you did use the word prelapsarian when you were replying to me earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
So could I make more a general comment, which maybe you'd like to comment on? Would it be true to say that whereas Augustine talks about things as they are, Aquinas talks about things as they should be?
I mean, I'm terrified of saying anything about Augustine in front of you. So, I mean, tell me more. At first blush, that seems plausible to me. But what aspect of the prelapsarian thing made you think of that?
Well, I mean, would you want to say that if the world had been prelapsarian, there wouldn't have been any malaria or mosquitoes?
Ah, good. So, I think for Aquinas, there would have been mosquitoes. There probably would have been malaria.
So they wouldn't have been mosquitoes. It'd been something else then.
Wait, so here I defer to the experts in the audience. I didn't think it was a per se feature of mosquitoes that they give malaria. But here is a per se. So it's a per se feature of lions, right? That they are carnivores, right? And so Aquinas is very clear, right? So he thinks, prior to the fall, carnivores were still carnivores, right? And herbivores were still herbivores. And it's just that God, by a divine act of protection, guaranteed that no lions would eat us. But they would still eat lambs. Maybe not on the Holy Mountain or something. But in that sense, for Aquinas, there would have been the natures of things would not have been radically different, right? In such a way that would kind of homogenize. But maybe that's unhelpful as an answer.
No, makes sense to me. Why would the lions be interested in eating?
Yeah. Maybe last question? Okay.
I hope this isn't too open-ended, but if we were to apply this Thomas theory to our public policy, how would it help us to be better stewards of the natural world that God has bequeathed to us?
Yeah, great question. There are people who self-identify as green Thomists. I'm not one of them, but I certainly do think that this has application to the project, right? To kind of work, in the practical order, the final cause is the first principle, right? So you want to start with the ultimate place that you want to get, right? The ultimate destination, and then work backwards with respect to, and then ultimately terminate at what your first step is going to be. So I do think that you'd start with setting the goal according to this final causal goodness, right? So what is what does the well-ordered cosmos look like? What does a harmonious existence between human beings and the broader environment look like? And that's actually not, I think, especially hard to identify, right? We can tell when there's conflict and dissonance, right? And then you work backwards, right? So if that's the goal, if that's where we want to get, this kind of harmonious cosmos, of which we are stewards, right? And we know by revelation that that was our first vocation, right? Then what we need to do as stewards is cultivate this cosmos in which we live so as to foster the proper perfections of things that contribute to the overall harmonious good, and stymie either the non-proper perfections and operations of things, or stymie the proper perfections and operations of things that ultimately are going to get things out of balance, right? So I come from part of the United States that we have a whole lot of woods and a whole lot of deer, right? And so I know what it looks like when the deer population is too much, right? And so at a certain point, you do need to cull the population for its own good, right? And so you get to the, that's on the level of accidental goodness, right? And then it ultimately gets you to this question of substantial goodness, like culling the deer population. So, but I'll stop there.
Well, thank you for the
Yeah, thanks y'all. That's great.
So I'd like to invite you to come for drinks in the old library so we can continue discussing this very interesting topic.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, spirits are